Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are continuing our Dawn of X coverage. Yes, we are. And in this video, we are picking up with Excalibur. Here's the cool thing about this, right? Here's the cool thing about this. This is really going to kind of allow us a chance to offer some pretty cool explanations insofar as how like the Captain Britain Corps works, Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, the collapse of the multiverse, how all that stuff ties into what's going on right now with his X-Men run. This is why I always tell people, if you want to read Jonathan Hickman's work, read it by itself. Do not read anything else unless you absolutely have to. This is an example of where you kind of have to, right? Because other people are writing the Swords of X story as opposed to just Jonathan Hickman, and it all basically ties together. But you can literally just read Hickman by himself and read nothing else, and just maybe catch up on a couple things here and there. But the cool thing here is it allows us a bit of an explanation. But before we get to that point, we pick up with the arrival of Jamie Braddock and Brian Braddock as they've been summoned by Saturnine. And the whole idea is that as they're meeting Betsy Braddock here, right? As they're meeting, Captain Britain here, once they arrive, things get pretty murky pretty fast. And the reason why is because as Brian Braddock shows up here, Betsy realizes he's in possession of the Sword of Might. And when she asks, why is that here? His response is, because I brought it for you. And the idea of Brian Braddock is to basically switch these things, right? For Brian to retake the amulet and for Betsy to take the Sword of Might. Now, here's the reason why that matters. Because once all that passes and they're basically met by the arrival of Saturnine, that she's assembled them here. And it looks like it's basically a kind of giant get-together to honor the fallen Captain Britain Corps that existed before the events of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. But the idea is that this kind of argument is taking place in such a way to where Brian wants things to go back to the way they were before. That one of the things that Saturnine talks about is the fall of the Captain Britain Corps. Now, the way this worked was the result of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, right? So the Captain Britain Corps in previous years was largely created by Merlin and then Roma, and a combination of both. And the way this would play out is that in any one universe, on any one Earth out there, that what you would have is some individual who would be met at some point in time by Merlin or Roma or both. And what they would do is they would present them with an option. They would say, you have the choice of the Sword of Might or the Amulet of Right. There wasn't really a wrong answer there, but whichever one they took, they would go forward with those corresponding powers, and they would in effect become the Captain Britain of their universe. And the idea is that the Captain Britain of that universe would serve to protect that universe, but also serve as part of a larger whole. They would protect the multiverse alongside other Captain Britain members. And so think of it as a more localized version of a much larger version of the Green Lantern Corps. And so the result of this is that during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, as we covered with that story, that there came a point where Saturnine and the Omniversal Development Court were trying to understand why the multiverse was collapsing, right? They didn't fully understand it. And so what they ended up doing was getting their hands on a map maker with a desire to effectively crack the map maker, understand its code, and then get a bigger picture. The problem with this was that the map maker ended up summoning its own forces, right? And it really was more of a Sidera Madri as opposed to a map maker, but they ended up summoning the forces of both the Ivory Kings and the Ivory King soldiers. And this led to the complete and total annihilation of the Captain Britain Corps. The only person who survived was Brian Braddock. And Brian Braddock only survived because Saturnine took all the knowledge of the Starlight Citadel, right? So all information containing the existence of the multiverse and everything that she knew about the multiverse, and literally used telepathy to put it in the mind of Brian Braddock and then cast him out, right? And he basically ended up showing back up to the Illuminati at some point in time. But that's how the Captain Britain Corps fell. Now, following the restoration of the multiverse, the Captain Britain Corps was not restored. The reason for that is because the method and manner of choosing the Captain Britain Corps is not arbitrary, the Sword of Might or the Amulet of Right. And in years past, this is kind of what Saturnine says here, in years past, Captain Britons who were chosen for that particular role had to undergo that test. What we're told here is there are Captain Britons out there in the multiverse, but Saturnine considers them to be heretical. She considers them to be heretics because they have not undergone the process of choosing between the sword or the amulet. And so because they have not undergone that traditional process, they're not real Captain Britons. For all intents and purposes, the way that Saturnine views it, somebody just grabbed a Captain Britain uniform, slapped it on, and now they're that character, right? They're not the rightful character. They haven't undergone the process a person should undergo in order to become that, in order to overtake that role. And so because of that, while there are Captain Britons there, she's basically captured them, and she's holding them until she decides when they're ready to be destroyed. And so in this frustration and this irritation, as far as Saturnine is is concerned, while Brian Braddock is not in possession of the amulet, he is in possession of the sword. And Brian Braddock is the only true Captain Britain. That Betsy Braddock is not. That Betsy Braddock is considered to be a heretic in the eyes of Saturnine. And this really is kind of doubled down by Betsy's own admission when Saturnine makes the case about the sword and the amulet, and Betsy says, I never had to make either choice. And that's when Saturnine's like, those are your words, not mine. In effect, in the eyes of Saturnine, Betsy Braddock doomed herself, and she basically gave Saturnine license to take her captive, right? And that's what she kind of says, like, the exit's that way, right? You don't need to be here. Like, there's no reason for you to be here. Now, as she goes to kind of make her way, she's met by Brian. And the crazy thing about this is that she kind of challenges Brian to a fight, right? She's like, let's get this on, right? Let's figure this out once and for all. Like, who is the actual Captain Britain? The cool thing about this, and what's interesting here, is that Brian's response is, I gave you the amulet. If you guys remember the Excalibur story, the first one that we did, his response was, I gave you the amulet because I was being taken over by Morgan Le Fay. In this moment, when I was basically being transformed into her henchman, I did not want her to have a henchman that had the power of the amulet, so I gave it to you. But this was only ever meant to be temporary, that ultimately I knew that you guys would win against Morgan Le Fay, and when that time came, I hoped that you would give the amulet back to me. That's why I gave you this sword. The response of Betsy is, I don't want to give it back to you, right? I like being Captain Britain. I want to stay Captain Britain. Like, the whole idea of Brian Braddock is, but you don't even live in England. Like, you live in Krakoa. You live in a whole different place. What kind of Captain Britain could you possibly be if you don't even live in the place you represent, right? It doesn't really make any sense. It's like a president of the United States that lives in Japan. It's nonsensical. It just doesn't work that way, right? Now, at this point, it's really just kind of arguing geographic location. But if we're being honest with ourselves, because a Captain Britain can become that way by taking the sword or the amulet, then we're really just kind of arguing semantics, is really what's happening here. That's all this is coming down to. But the funny thing about this is that as they kind of begin to get into a little bit of their fight, Betsy Braddock does make a really good point in saying that becoming Captain Britain is an honor. It's not a birthright, right? You're not owed this. You're not owed the role of Captain Britain. Despite what the lineage is, and despite your ties to King Arthur, you're not owed this role. You had this role bestowed upon you at one point in time, but it could also have been taken away. And if it can be taken away from you, then it's not a thing that you inherently own, right? It's a thing that's just given to you for some temporary amount of time. Even if that temporary amount of time just happens to be your entire life, it can be taken away at any point in time. And so what you end up doing here is you kind of have this whole situation that's kind of interrupted, right, by Saturnine, and she's like, you guys need to calm down. But the funny thing about this is she kind of seems to be sowing discord among the two, right? Like, she kind of seems to be creating a rift among these two. Now, what we end up doing is picking up later that night. And when that happens, you end up having Jamie Braddock, who's kind of sleeping, in his guest quarters, and is met by what's essentially an assemblage of Captain Britons that are different characters based on the X-Men, right? So Rogue, who's a Captain Britain, Gambit, who's a Captain Britain, Jubilee, that kind of a thing. And so the result of this is that they basically say, like, we sentence you to die. Right now, the motivation for why they sentence him to die, we're not really given a definitive explanation here. Instead, what ends up happening, and it kind of looks as though Jamie may have sold them out, but what it looks like happened here, or at least what does happen here, is you have Betsy and you have Brian, who of course respond, and then once they get in there, Jamie's got all these guys seized, right? Now again, Jamie Braddock can warp reality on a universal scale, and that's what those strings are, right? Those strings that emanate, that's how it is that he controls reality. Now, this is just kind of shown to us for artistic license. It's just kind of shown to us, like, this is what he's actually doing. In terms of how it is that, like, Betsy and Brian Braddock see it, he's just standing there and they're floating in thin air and all hell's popping loose, right? That's all it kind of looks to them. This is just kind of shown so that we can get an artistic understanding of how his powers work. But the whole point behind this is he's kind of like, okay, they showed up here with the intention of killing me. I can't just let that slide. But, if I can't kill them all, then I'll just kill one to help them understand their place in the bigger picture. And so in doing that, he kills the Captain Britain Jubilee, right? He kills the Jubilee version of Captain Britain. And so once she's dead, it pisses off all the others, right? They go after them and they end up taking off, right? They end up basically bailing out. Brian Braddock ultimately ends up drawing the sword of might from the scabbard, and when he does, he becomes a version of Captain Britain using the sword of might, right? Now, at that moment, he in turn turns it on the rest of the Captain Britain Corps and says, I will strike you down if I have to. I don't want to, but I will kill you if I have to. But that's when Saturnine steps in. And so she basically, she kind of appeals to Brian Braddock, right? With this idea, kind of appealing to his manly nature, right? Being a little romantic and so on, and saying, like, get rid of this sword of might. You don't need this anymore, right? I am the sole occupant of the Starlight Citadel. Merlin and Roma are long dead. I determine who's going to be the Captain Britain from this point going forward. And so she basically tells him, get rid of the sword. She tries to strip the amulet away from Betsy Braddock with the intention of giving it to Brian, but Betsy uses a combination of her power along with some spells that she learned from Apocalypse and destroys the amulet in the process. Now, the reason why this matters is because the amulet is what gives that version of Captain Britain their power, right? So like flight, force field, different things like that, enhanced strength, super speed, so on and so forth, without the amulet, those powers can't freely be given, right? It would have to be restored or something along those lines. As a result of that, she ends up having Betsy Braddock taken away and takes Brian to what is basically her bedchamber. And so as a result of this, you pick up with Betsy Braddock, right? Kind of down in this holding cell. And she kind of tries to reach out. So far, she hasn't really been successful, but she tries to reach out and is ultimately met by the Gambit version of Captain Britain from whatever alternate reality that happens to be. And what she basically says is, or at least having this conversation with them, she asks, like, you know, are you guys okay? Right? Is everything okay? And the funny thing is, like, she tells them, like, we'll try, like, I'm going to try to find a way out. But what she's told by Gambit is escaping the cells is no small thing. If all you had to do is pick a lock and leave, it wouldn't really be much of a prison cell. And so what he tells her is there are spells that surround this cell. And the way in which it works is that when Rogue tried to break out, she literally just tried to fly out of it and got exceedingly cold. And she can't get any warm now, right? Like, she got cold, she got lost, and she can't warm up, right? So there's an effect that it has on you. It's that kind of magic that keeps people contained within these cells. And so what ends up happening is that while she's telepathically communicating with Gambit, that Jimmy Braddock piggybacks onto their communications, right? And says, okay, so like, you need to jump out the window now, and I will catch you, right? I mean, they're so high up that if you were to jump out, you'd probably end up getting yourself killed when you hit the ground. And the fact that she doesn't really have the amulet means her normal powers, or the powers of Captain Britain, aren't readily available to her. Now, you could kind of ask the question, if she really is that powerful in terms of her telekinesis, why couldn't she just fly? That's a good question to ask. I don't know why we don't get an answer to that, but it kind of seems to be this sort of revolving spell that exists, right? That, like, if she jumps out the window, then she gets caught up in the spell. And so the response to this of Jamie Braddock is, okay, you could stay here, but keep in mind, you're in Otherworld, and they're going to execute you at dawn. So when you die, like, if you die, or when the time comes, if you're executed and you die, they can bring you back on Krakoa. But remember, guys, if you die in Otherworld and they resurrect you in Krakoa, you come back all screwed up, right? You come back all twisted and screwed up. We saw that in the last couple of videos that we made. That's one of the important points about dying in Otherworld that remains for the rest of Swords of X. If you die out there, there's no guarantee that the version of you that comes back will be the version who died. It could be any other alternate reality version of yourself, right? So maybe Betsy Braddock jumps out, or she's executed in the morning, and Krakoa resurrects her, and she comes back as like some crazy, some absolutely nuts girl who's hell-bent on world domination, right? There's no way of knowing if that's going to be the case, right? No way of knowing what version of her will come back. And so because of that, you end up having her, of course, making this leap of faith out the window, and then being caught by a griffin, right? That belongs to Jamie Braddock, who of course rescues her, and the two of them make their way towards Saturnine's bedchamber. And as she's there, what she ends up doing is basically telling Brian Braddock, you're the one that needs to represent this prophecy, right? You're the one that needs to basically wield this Starlight sword, not Betsy Braddock. She's not a real Captain Britain. This has to be you. You have to be the one to wield this weapon. And so what she ends up doing is basically crafting the Starlight sword itself. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, and this is something that we may not have really covered or hadn't been too clear on, is that this whole idea that, of course, you know, once Betsy Braddock and them show up, you know, and like literally you have Saturnine making out with Brian Braddock, right? So, you know, like let's touch naughty bits, right? You have like you know, Betsy, and you have Jamie, who are kind of watching everything go down, and then Brian Braddock realizes she's there, and he's like, Betsy, take the sword now, right? Betsy runs in, grabs the sword, and we realize that Brian Braddock was never actually on the side of Saturnine, that he was basically playing her in order to give Betsy time to steal the Starlight sword herself, because that's part of the prophecy for the Swords of X event. One of the things to understand here is this prophecy is not something that predates Saturnine, right? It's not as though it's a prophecy that's been around for like millennia and it's just now coming to fruition. This is a game that Saturnine herself created, right? She created the prophecy. She created all of this, right? It's kind of her great big huge game to just sort of see what happens. We don't really know what the end result of this is. We don't really know what it is that she's trying to achieve. What's the point of standing in the way of the forces of Arakko that want to invade the main Marvel universe and kill everybody there? What's the point of that, right? If you're in the Starlight Citadel, what's the whole point? I mean, you're not really affected by any of it, so why does it matter to you, right? We don't really know what the end result of her whole campaign is. What we do know is this kind of effort between Brian and Betty has ultimately worked. That what it's done is it's drove Saturnine to create the Starlight Sword, which was the missing weapon that they needed in order to secure the forces of Earth fighting against the forces of Arakko. And so now they have both. They have the Sword of Might and they have the Starlight Sword. And so it solidifies this position, right? And so from here, it just boils down to 3 more swords, right? All we have are 3 more. My question here, and this is the question that I feel like a lot of you guys are asking, my question here is, when are we going to see the return of Mad Jim Jaspers? That's what I want. I want to see Jim Jaspers come back. I want to see him, and I want to see the Fury. I want to see that, because the Fury, I don't know if we ever did a Beyond Omega level video on the Fury. I think we did, and if we did, you know, my guys will have it down in the description. The Fury is wildly overpowered, right? He's insanely powerful. It's kind of nuts. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.